Let's go. Threats in puzzle position are: queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight, check. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes queen, check. The checks are: queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight, check. Bishop to g6, check. Rook takes queen, check. Solution to the puzzle is: rook takes queen, check. King takes rook. Queen to e3, check. King to f7. Queen takes rook. Next, here are the threats: rook takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Checks in puzzle position are: queen takes pawn, check. Queen to d1, check. The answer is: rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. Queen to d1, check. King to h2. Queen takes rook. Another puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: bishop takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes bishop. There are no checks in this position. The answer is: bishop takes knight. Bishop takes knight. Bishop takes bishop, check. King takes bishop. Queen to c3, check. Another one. Threats in this position are: queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes rook, check. The checks are: queen to f3, check. Queen to g4, check. Queen to e2, check. Queen to d2, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes rook, check. Answer to this puzzle is: rook takes rook, check. King takes rook. Rook to f1, checkmate. One more. Here are threats in puzzle position: bishop takes knight. Rook takes knight. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Checks in puzzle position are: queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is: queen takes pawn, check. King takes queen. Rook to h4, checkmate. One more. The threats are: bishop takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. The checks are: rook takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is: rook takes pawn, check. King takes rook. Queen to h5, checkmate. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to g8, check. Queen to h8, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is: queen to h8, check. Knight to g8. Bishop to a3, check. Rook to e7. Bishop takes rook, check. King takes bishop. Queen takes pawn, check. Next, here are the threats: knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes bishop, check. Checks in this position are: knight to f2, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Answer to this puzzle is: queen takes bishop, check. King takes queen. Rook to d1, checkmate. Another puzzle. The threats are: there are no threats in this position. Here are the checks: queen to h7, check. Queen to h8, check. Rook to f8, check. Solution to the puzzle is: rook to f8, check. King takes rook. Queen to h8, checkmate. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes queen, check. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Checks in this position are: queen to d2, check. Queen takes queen, check. Queen to a5, check. The answer is: queen takes queen, check. King takes queen. Knight takes pawn, check. King to e1. Knight takes rook. Another puzzle. Here are the threats: rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. The checks are: rook to a8, check. Rook takes pawn, check. The answer is: rook takes pawn, check. King takes rook. Rook to a8, checkmate. One more. The threats are: queen takes pawn. King takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes rook, check. Checks in this position are: rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes rook, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle: rook takes rook, check. King takes rook. Queen to f2, checkmate. Another puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position: rook takes bishop, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Checks in this position are. Rook takes bishop, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook to h8, check. The answer is. Rook takes bishop, check. King takes rook. Queen to g5, check. King to f8. Rook to h8, checkmate. Let's continue. The threats are. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are. Queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Knight takes pawn. Rook takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. King to h8. Queen takes rook. Next, the threats are. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen takes rook, check. King takes queen. Rook to e8, checkmate. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to b8, check. Queen to g7, check. Queen to h8, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Knight to f7. Queen takes knight. Pawn takes queen, check. King takes pawn. Queen to c7, check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook, check. Rook takes rook. The checks are. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook, check. The best move in puzzle position is. Rook takes rook. Queen takes rook. Rook takes pawn, check. King to f6. Rook to f7, check. King takes rook. Queen takes queen, check. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn. Checks in this position are. Bishop to e8, check. Knight to d6, check. Knight to g5, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Bishop to c4. Queen takes bishop. Knight to d6, check. King to e6. Knight takes queen. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Rook takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Queen to e8, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to e8, check. Queen to f8. Rook takes pawn, check. King takes rook. Rook to g1, check. King to f6. Queen takes queen. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes rook, check. King takes pawn. The checks are. Queen to e7, check. Queen to f7, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes rook, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Rook takes rook, check. King takes rook. Queen to e7, checkmate. Next puzzle. Here are the threats. Rook takes bishop. Checks in puzzle position are. Knight to e5, check. Knight to g5, check. Bishop to g6, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes bishop. King takes rook. Bishop to b3, check. c4. Bishop takes pawn, check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes rook. Rook takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Queen to g7, check. Queen takes rook, check. Rook takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using. Rook takes pawn, check. King takes rook. Rook to h5, checkmate. Another one. Here are threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are. Pawn takes pawn, check. The answer is. Pawn takes pawn, check. King takes pawn. Queen to e6, check. King to g7. Queen takes knight. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Pawn takes pawn, check. Pawn takes pawn, check. The checks are. Pawn takes pawn, check. Pawn takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Pawn takes pawn, check. King takes pawn. Queen to g7, checkmate. One more, threats in puzzle position are. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn. Checks in this position are. Rook takes rook, check. Queen to d2, check. Queen to c1, check. The answer is. Rook takes rook, check. King takes rook. Queen to e5, check. Thank you for watching, please like and subscribe.